Music, the winter of 1873, came early to the Montana Territory, sweeping down from the northern peaks like a starving wolf. Snow buried the wagon trails, swallowed the pines, and turned the world into a silent, frozen grave. The wind tore across the mountains with a voice like something ancient and angry. Margaret Sullivan stood in that wind, her hands stiff and bleeding from the cold as she pressed two broken wagons, spokes into the frozen earth, to mark the spot where her husband now lay. Thomas Sullivan, husband, father, protector gone. Her 5-year-old son James tugged at her skirt. His face was pale, his breath misting the air. "Mama, when's Papa coming back?" Margaret's voice trembled as she knelt, wrapping her arms around him. "Papa's gone to heaven, sweetheart. It's just us now. 3 days had passed since the bandits came. Desperate men, driven by hunger and greed, had fallen upon their wagon train at dawn. Gunfire shattered the morning quiet. Thomas fought like a man defending everything he'd ever loved, but there had been too many. Margaret still heard the sound of that last gunshot, the one that took him, echoing in her head every time the wind rose. When it was over, she hid under their overturned wagon with James, her hand clamped over his mouth as smoke and screams filled the air. When silence finally fell, she crawled out to a world burned and broken. Their horses were gone, the supplies stolen, and Thomas lay still in the snow. Now there was nothing left, only her and her son. She packed what little she could. A handful of cornmeal, some dried beans, Thomas's rifle, a dented pot, and their family Bible, wrapping James in every scrap of clothing she could find. She slung the sack over her shoulder. "We're going on an adventure," she told him, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "We're going to walk through the mountains to Cedar Falls, just like the explorers in your picture book." The snow came to her knees. The forest loomed dark and close, full of secrets and dangers. Every gust of wind carried the faint cry of wolves. By midday, she'd gone only a few miles. James whimpered from hunger and cold. She stopped by a fallen log, sat, and gave him a handful of cornmeal mixed with snow. It wasn't food, just a promise that things would somehow be better soon. But they wouldn't, not out here. As dusk came, the howls grew louder. Margaret's heart raced. She scanned the shadows, clutching the rifle in trembling hands. Her breath came in sharp, cold gasps. She needed shelter. Through the thickening storm, she saw a cluster of rocks forming a shallow cave. It wasn't much, but it was something. Dragging James inside, she gathered what branches she could and struggled to light a fire. Her hands shook too hard. The matches were damp, and it took nearly all she had left to spark a flame. The fire burned weakly, barely enough to chase back the darkness. Outside, the wolf circled, glowing eyes in the blackness, watching, waiting. James pressed against her side. "Tell me about Papa, Mama." Margaret stared into the flames. He was brave. She whispered, "The bravest man I ever knew. He loved you more than all the stars in the sky." The fire began to die. The cold crept closer. The wolves moved nearer, and Margaret knew that when the last ember went out, so would they. She whispered a prayer, her lips trembling. "Please, Lord, just one more chance." Then came a sound that didn't belong to the wolves. Heavy, steady footsteps crunching through the snow. Margaret stiffened. Her hands flew to the rifle. "Who's there?" She called, her voice cracking. "Stay back. I'm armed." The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Then, out of the shadows, a massive figure appeared. Half man, half beast. His coat was made of bear hide, his beard thick with frost, his eyes reflecting fire light like an animal's. He looked at her at the tiny fire, the frightened child, the woman clutching a gun. She could barely lift. "That fire will die in an hour," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel. "You'll die an hour after that." Margaret swallowed hard. We'll manage. The man took another step forward and she caught the scent of him. Smoke, leather, wildness. The wolves had fallen silent now, as if even they feared him. Where's your man? He asked. Dead, she said. Bandits 3 days ago. Something flickered in his eyes. Not pity, not kindness, just recognition. You alone. She lifted her chin. We're heading to Cedar Falls. The man laughed, a hard, humorless sound. Cedar Falls is 5 days through these mountains in good weather. You got food for 5 days. Know which way the snow hides the cliff edges. You and that boy will be dead before you reach sunrise. Margaret's silence was answer enough. The stranger moved then fast as a striking bear. He knocked the rifle aside and stepped close. She could see the scars on his face. Wildness in his eyes. Your body is mine until I have my sons. He growled. Margaret's heart thundered. She wanted to scream, to run, but where could she go? Into the storm, into the wolves. James whimpered. That sound stopped her from doing anything rash. Whatever this man meant, whatever he wanted, her child's life came first. He seemed to sense her thoughts. You come with me, he said, voice like thunder, or you die here. Quote. Margaret looked down at James, his small face pale and frightened. She looked back up at the man, this savage creature who seemed born of. The mountain itself will come, she whispered. The man nodded once. Keep up. He kicked snow over the dying fire, slung her pack over his shoulder as if it weighed nothing, and started into the forest. Margaret lifted James, her arms aching, and followed. Behind them, the wolves began to howl again, a long, mournful sound that carried through the storm. And so began their journey into the wild heart of the mountains. A widow, her child, and the man who claimed them. The mountain man led them through the storm like a creature born of it. His steps were sure and powerful, cutting a path through the snow where Margaret could barely lift her feet. He didn't speak, didn't look back, only trudged forward through the endless white, the wind howling around him like an obedient hound. Margaret stumbled more than once, clutching James tight, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Each time she thought she could go no further, the mountain man's rough hand would close around her arm and haul her upright without a word. Hours passed. The world narrowed to cold darkness and the sound of their footsteps. Then, just as dawn began to smear the sky with pale light, the man stopped before a steep ridge. Give me the boy, he said. Margaret shook her head, clutching James tighter. I can carry him. You can barely stand. His eyes glinted through the snow. Give him here or we all freeze. Reluctantly, she handed over her son. The man tucked the child inside his bare-skinned coat, one massive hand steadying him. Then he reached out and grabbed Margaret's wrist. Hold on, he ordered. Ground's bad here. They climbed. The slope was slick with ice, and the trees were thick, their branches heavy with snow. Margaret's boots slipped again and again, but each time his grip tightened, keeping her from falling. When they finally reached the top, she gasped at what she saw. A small clearing nestled against the mountain face, and there, built from logs darkened by weather and smoke, stood a cabin. A thin column of smoke curled from its chimney. The mountain man pushed open the door and ushered them inside. The warmth hit her like a blow. Her frozen skin burned as the heat returned. She blinked, taking in the room. It was large and sturdy, with walls sealed by moss and mud. Animal pelts covered the floor and hung on the walls. A stone fireplace filled the room with golden light. There was a table, rough-hewn chairs, and in the corner, a bed piled high with furs. The man set James down by the fire. He shrugged off his coat, revealing arms thick with muscle and old scars. His face, now clear in the light, was weathered and harsh, but not cruel, not entirely. Sit, he said, pointing to the bench. Boy needs food. Margaret obeyed, her limbs trembling from exhaustion. James's lips were blue, but color was slowly returning to his cheeks as the warmth seeped in. The man moved to a corner, cutting strips of dried meat and dropping them into an iron pot. Soon, the smell of cooking venison filled the air. "What's your name?" Margaret asked, her voice. He paused, glancing at her as if surprised by the question. "Josiah Reed. I'm Margaret Sullivan. This is my son, James." Josiah grunted in acknowledgement and turned back to the pot. When the food was ready, he set wooden bowls on the table. "Eat." Margaret fed James first, spooning the hot broth carefully into his mouth. Then she ate slow and grateful. It was simple food, but it felt like a miracle. Josiah watched them in silence, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. When they finished, he stood. "Boy sleeps there." He pointed to a pile of furs near the fire. "You sleep there." He motioned to the bed in the corner. She hesitated. "Where will you sleep?" "I don't sleep much." He took his rifle from beside the door. "Don't try to run. Wolves will get you before the cold does." Then he stepped outside into the dawn, leaving her alone with her son. Margaret looked around the cabin again, this strange refuge that might also be her prison. James was already half asleep, curled in the furs. She brushed the hair from his forehead and whispered a prayer of thanks. Her eyes wandered to the shelves along the wall. Among the tools and traps were unexpected things: a Bible, a few old books, a wooden horse half, carved, its shape delicate and careful. Whoever Josiah Reed was, he was not only what he seemed. When sleep finally took her, it came heavy and deep. She woke to the sound of wood splitting. Through the window, she saw Josiah outside, swinging an axe with steady rhythm. Without his coat, she could see the power in his movements, the way his muscles flexed beneath his worn shirt. He worked like a man who made peace with solitude, who needed no one. James stirred by the fire. "Mama, where are we?" "We're safe," she said softly. Thanks to him. As if summoned by her words, Josiah entered, arms full of wood. He stacked it by the hearth and began preparing another meal. Corn cakes and venison, this time with a precious drizzle of molasses for James. "Thank you," Margaret said. He glanced up, expression unreadable. Then, without answering, he went back to his work. After they ate, he stood before her, his shadow filling the room. "You remember what I said last night?" Margaret's stomach tightened. "I remember. Mountain law is different than your town law," he said, his voice low but firm. "A man takes a woman. She's his until he says otherwise. You understand." She looked him straight in the eye. "I understand you saved our lives, and I understand my son needs food and shelter." Beyond that, she let the words hang. For the first time, she saw something flicker in his gaze. Not anger, but maybe respect. "You'll work for your keep," he said finally. "Cooking, cleaning, mending. Try to run, and I'll find you before you've gone a mile." Clear, clear, from that day, a strange rhythm began. Josiah left each morning to check his traps. Margaret kept the fire going, cooked, mended clothes, tended to James. Days passed, the snow deepened. The mountains seemed to close around them, sealing them away from the world. On the fourth night, a blizzard hit, worse than any she'd seen. The cabin shook with the force of the wind. Ice formed on the inside walls. James shivered beneath his blankets. Josiah rose from his chair, gathering all the furs and dragging them into one pile near the fire. "We sleep here tonight," he said. "Body will keep us alive." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. She settled James in the middle. Josiah lay on the other side, his back to her. Outside, the wind screamed like a living thing. Inside, the three of them lay together, a widow, a child, and a man who lived like a wolf. As the fire crackled, Margaret whispered into the dark, "Why do you live out here alone?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then quietly, easier than living with people, "Were you always alone?" "No." His voice cracked slightly. "I had a family once." The storm roared louder, but neither spoke again. They lay in silence, bound by the shared warmth between them and the unspoken truths the mountains kept. Outside, the wolves howled, but this time their cries sounded far away. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was buried beneath a thick white blanket. Sunlight shimmered off the snow, turning the mountains into a blinding ocean of silver. Josiah dug out the cabin door, his movements sure and tireless. Margaret watched him from inside, feeling something shift quietly inside her. Fear had ruled her since the night he'd found them. But now, as she saw the way he moved, careful, deliberate, protective, she felt something else. Not trust yet, but the faint beginning of it. Over the following weeks, their strange life found rhythm. Josiah taught her to split wood, to melt snow for water, to keep the fire alive through the long nights. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. When she burned supper once, expecting his anger, he only grunted and said, "Try again." When she dropped a water bucket and began to cry, he said, "Crying won't keep you warm. Fetch another." Hard lessons, but beneath them, Margaret sensed purpose. He was teaching her how to survive. She learned quickly. Her hands grew rough, her back strong. James, full of childish energy, explored the cabin and asked endless questions. Josiah answered some, ignored others, but he always made sure. The boy was fed warm and safe. One gray afternoon, while Josiah was away checking his traps, Margaret decided to clean and organize his supplies. Behind a stack of flour sacks, she found an old wooden chest. Its lock was broken, the lid covered in dust. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were remnants of another life. A woman's faded blue dress, a pair of small shoes, a photograph of a smiling woman with a child on her lap. At the bottom lay a Bible. On its inside cover was written Josiah Reed and Mary Reed, June 12, 1867. Samuel Reed, born March 3, 1868. Margaret sat for a long time, staring at those names. The man who had claimed her with words of dominance had once been a husband, a father he had loved, lost, and buried his heart in these mountains. When Josiah returned that evening, she said nothing, but she watched him differently, seeing not just the wild man, but the grief that lived under his skin. That night, as the wind whispered outside, James asked, "Mr. Josiah, why don't you have any children?" Josiah froze, then said quietly, "Had a boy once about your size." "What happened to him? Fever, him and his mama both long time ago." Silence filled the cabin, then James said softly, "I'm sorry." Josiah didn't answer, but his big scarred hand came to rest gently on the boy's shoulder. The next morning, the world outside had changed again. Snowmelt ran in rivulets down the mountain. The air was warmer, carrying the smell of pine and thawing earth. "Spring's coming," Josiah said, studying the clouds. "Soon as the pass is clear, we'll go down to Cedar Falls, trade pelts, buy supplies." The idea filled Margaret with both relief and dread. Returning to civilization meant judgment, questions, reminders of the world she'd left behind. When they finally made the trip, the small town of Cedar Falls came into view like a memory from another life. The people stared as they rode in, the rough mountain man, the widow, and her boy. Whispered words followed them, half curiosity, half condemnation. At the general store, Margaret stood beside Josiah as he traded pelts for flour, salt, and ammunition. The shopkeeper's wife stared openly. That the widow Sullivan, she muttered to another woman, living up there with that wild man, shameful. Margaret's cheeks burned, but Josiah's deep voice silenced them. "You got something to say to me. Say it plain. Otherwise, keep your tongue." The women looked away, flustered. Then, to everyone's surprise, Reverend Morrison, an older man with kind eyes, stepped forward. "Mrs. Sullivan, Mr. Reed, he said warmly, it's good to see you both alive and well. Word travels. We heard you saved Widow Cooper this winter. She said someone left her meat by her door every week. Margaret blinked in surprise. That was Josiah cut in. Did what needed doing. The Reverend smiled. You've done good work up there, both of you. God sees it, even if folks don't. Quote, when they left town that afternoon, the whispers behind them had softened. Not all eyes were judging any more. Some were curious, some perhaps admiring. That night, camped by a stream under a bright moon, Margaret couldn't sleep. She found Josiah sitting alone by the fire, carving wood. What are you thinking? She asked quietly. He didn't look up. Thinking about what that preacher said about how people look at you at us. She moved closer. Let them look. We know the truth of what we are. He turned toward her then, fire light flickering in his dark eyes. What are we, Margaret? She met his gaze, steady, a family. He was silent for a long time. Then he said softly, when I first found you, I said your body was mine until I had my sons. I was wrong. You were never mine to take, yours to give. Her eyes stung with tears, and I give it. Freely, Josiah, I give you everything because you've given everything to us. He reached out, rough hand brushing her cheek. You saved me as much as I saved you. The sound of small footsteps made them both turn. James stood in the shadows, clutching his blanket. Mama, Mr. Josiah, the wolves are singing. Indeed, from the forest came a low, mournful howl. But it didn't sound frightening anymore. It sounded like home. Josiah smiled faintly. They're saying the pack strong tonight. Margaret took his hand, her heart full. Then we are 2 months passed. Spring turned to summer. They built a new cabin closer to the valley near a stream where flowers grew. Josiah and Margaret married in a small ceremony under the open sky. Reverend Morrison said the words. James stood proudly between them. And even a wolf's distant cry seemed like a blessing. Years later, the valley would call them the Reed family, the quiet mountain folk who helped travelers, fed orphans, and taught strength to anyone who crossed their path. And every night when the wind blew through the pines, Margaret would remember the blizzard, the fire, the man who'd claimed her life with wild words, and how through struggle and forgiveness, those words became a promise of love. Because in the wild heart of the Montana mountains, they had found what most never did.